Hi, folks. I'm Father Joe Grimaldi. You can call me Joe, and I'd like to welcome you to my podcast. But now, here's our host and friend, Ken Calvert.
Hi again, everybody. It's Ken Calvert along with Father Joe Grimaldi, and welcome to the Father Joe Grimaldi podcast.
Happy to be here.
Father Joe Grimaldi, I was talking with you in our last podcast about when is it, what age do people tend to stray away from the church. We were talking about younger kids. You were talking about confirmation. And then you came up with that great line, which was hatched, matched, and dispatched. So we're born, we're married, and then we go to the other side. I had a question for you about that. Take the marriage. Let's say the woman is a devout Catholic, and the husband isn't a practicing Catholic. He's not a Catholic. Can that be a difficult situation within the marriage to handle?
Because you say, can it be? I have to say yes.
Okay.
Is it always? No. Matter of fact, very recently, I had the opportunity to preside at a wedding where the woman was a devout Catholic and the man was non-Christian. Not just non-Catholic, but non-Christian. After working with them for a number of sessions, it came to my mind that this particular person, the non-Christian, seemed to be much more Christian than many Catholics that I know. And so that because of his interest in a higher being, I don't know what did it to. I have to explain something else.
Please do.
He had attended a Catholic grade school in the state of Michigan. And I think...
But he wasn't born a Catholic.
And he never became a Catholic either.
Right.
But it's interesting that...
that gets back to our discipline.
Yeah, well, the discipline, but also the idea of trying to do the right thing, trying to have values and so on. When you listen to this individual, you would certainly love him to be your son. He's just a wonderful person, and he's going to be a great complement to his wife. He's not opposed to her practicing religion. Now, you asked the question, can it be difficult? It can. There's no question, particularly on a particular Sunday morning, decides that, well, I think I'll go with you this Sunday, but I don't want to go regularly. Okay, so this is where a little bit of tension might occur, but it doesn't have to. I'm going to give you one more example that's something that I'll never forget. I was principal of a high school that was Catholic, and the librarian was the wife of an executive who, when she married and she took seriously her promise to raise her children Catholic. And so, when she had children, she had several, what happens was she never once missed Mass. This woman lived to be 100 years of age, literally. And I would ask her every so often, why do you continue going to church? She never missed on Sundays. And she said, I made a promise, and I'm going to keep that promise. I was raising, and I did raise my children Catholic, and obviously I was always helpful for my husband. But I wanted to very much continue to keep my promise. I said, then why aren't you baptized? And she simply said, I don't have the faith.
Really?
Even in her old age. And she never missed Mass. I don't have the faith. I can't understand that. I do understand this much. Faith is a gift from God. Not everybody has it. And so maybe she falls into that category. I'm not expert enough to say that that was the case here, but that certainly was her case. She did not have the faith. She didn't mind going to Mass every Sunday and bringing the troops to church and so on, making sure they had all of the sacraments and so on. But she herself would go, but did not have the faith. So obviously, in that case, there were no problems in a couple not being of the same religion. Now, another thing, I might go out on a limb in saying this, but if you have two people who are Catholic, neither of them are strong Catholics, what do? Well, if somebody finds a decent religion, I would say fine, let him go or let her go. And if they could at least...
Or let them go.
Yeah, let them go. At least this way, there'll be some values in their lives, this type of thing. It's not an easy question to answer because it's so different with each person. But to answer your question, yes, it can be a difficult situation. Another thing,
Excuse me. You don't discourage a couple, do you?
Of what?
If she's a practicing Catholic and he isn't, let's say just he's not religious, do you say, this could create a problem down the road? Do you feel obliged to say that?
I feel obliged to say that, yes, there are problems. However, I will say this much.
Yeah.
I do not want you to convert unless you really want to.
Oh, okay.
That would be a mistake.
Right.
You really convert, not because of her or him, but you convert because you really want to. It's a disaster when they convert because of the wife or the husband.
Yeah.
I think they have to do it because they really want
I bet that was done more 25, 30 years ago.
Oh, very much so. I mean, there's a lot of good Catholics, by the way, and they never miss Mass, but they became Catholics only because they wanted to marry a Catholic.
Huh, that's very interesting.
So you see that a lot.
You have to be the counselor in this, and you have to be one that is looking out for the marriage, looking out for us. You are the shepherd. I was just curious.
See, another problem occurs when you have that kind of a situation, and it concerns the children, because people will say, well, I'm not going to force them to become Catholic. Well, they're marrying a non-Catholic. The Catholic has to promise that he or she will do her best, or his best, to raise the children Catholic. There's no such thing as, well, let them decide when they're adults. Well, that's a mistake anyway, because the kids are too young to understand why Johnny next door is going to church on the weekend and here I am not doing anything, and I'm supposed to decide whether or not I want to be a Catholic when I'm 25. I mean, that's not the way it works. They need something. If they want to leave their religion later, that's up to them. But at least give them something to follow. And to just say, well, we're going to let them decide when they're adults.
That doesn't work, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Yeah. Very fascinated by this for some reason. I thought it would be a simple question. When you do marry in that situation, there is no Mass, correct?
Well, yes, correct. But let me give you the reason for that is when you have a Catholic and then you have
marrying a non-Catholic,
the marriage takes place in the church. And because it would be easier for the non-Catholics to be part of that service fully, rather than to be separated because they're receiving communion and we're not, we usually recommend a prayer service. And so that we still have the 3 readings, we still have prayer of the faithful, we still have a homily, we still have the marriage, but there's no Mass. Now, this way, we don't separate. Marriage is supposed to signify unity. And if we're going to separate people right at the wedding, it's not a good idea.
Yeah, not a good plan.
No, and so it's important that we at least do that much. And so very often what happens is we say one side, of course, is the non-Catholic side and the other is the Catholic, but we're not going to have a Mass.
You say this in church a lot, or you see it a lot, and other priests say it all the time as well, when you go to a situation like that where it's a service and not a Mass, or even at a Mass sometimes. If you're not Catholic, but you'd like to come up and get a blessing, feel free to do that. How many people take advantage of that?
A lot.
Do they?
But I don't like the wording of it.
Did I say it wrong?
No, not at all.
Please correct me when I do.
No, you didn't say anything wrong.
All right.
It's just a matter of how we put it. I would rather say,
How do you say it? I forget exactly
I would
how.
like to invite those people not receiving communion to come forward for a blessing, to indicate that, please just cross your arm,
Yeah.
this type of thing. So that this way it's okay because you can't receive communion.
Yeah, right.
No, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, leave it up to their adults. I invite you to come up for a blessing.
And you say that a decent number of people do.
A decent number of people do, yes.
Okay.
Very much so. Well, I was just going to say, there is a longing for religion, for spirituality in most people.
How do you know that?
You know that because of what you just said about those who are not Catholic, or at least those that come up for a blessing. You see it in their faces. They are touched by the blessing. It's amazing to me every time. They want that blessing. And then when you put your hand on their head and bless them, they're so thrilled with that.
Huh.
So it's meaningful for them. Now, if they don't like that, they're not going to come up at all.
Right.
So, and we don't know.
A lot of people don't do things because they're embarrassed, uncomfortable, or just the optics. I guess that's the word to use. People are concerned they'd like to do it, but they won't do it because of the optics.
Correct.
Like, oh,
What are they going to think?
yeah. Well, yeah, now this was strange. I was at this wedding the other day, and you know Bob up the street, right?
He went up,
I didn't take him for somebody that would want to be blessed, but he walked up anyway,
and he wanted it.
and I was surprised.
Now, that's not to say there aren't a number of, in quotes, first communions.
Now, let me go back to something. You said that almost instinctively we or you think people want to find or be
Spiritual.
you really think so?
I think people want spirituality in their lives.
Huh.
Generally speaking, now, I know we could always pick out a lot of people that
Yeah.
they would rather be in hell than do that.
We could have a full dinner over that one.
I know, I know.
Yeah, maybe we should. We'll be
Most-
back. We'll be back. We're starved now. Go ahead.
We did discuss at one point
Yeah.
people leaving the church, and what do? They join Kensington, or they join something that's non-sectarian,
Uh-huh.
because they need the spiritual aspect of a higher being. And so I don't think people attending a wedding, they love the idea of a spiritual blessing coming from above. One of the things I always try to make sure people understand, it's not magic.
You mentioned one of the very early podcasts, a prayer is not a form of superstition.
Superstition,
Yeah.
no, and it's not superstition. But
Right.
there are people that they really want to feel good.
Yes.
They're not Catholic,
Yeah.
but they want that blessing
Yeah.
from the priest. Now, whatever that may be, see, the priest is dressed in his alb and chasuble, whatever the case might be. Well, that too is impressive to a non-Catholic. You have this person in front representing the authority, representing God, representing Jesus. And so they're touched by the idea. I have a humorous situation here. I did a funeral of a family which had a number of Jewish relatives involved.
All right.
See? And so it was at the end of the at the mass. We had a mass because it was the grandfather of this little child. And at the end of the mass, he came up to me. He says, "Were you the rabbi who just said the mass?" So
You know what I would have said? Yeah.
I did. I
That's
said,
me.
"Yes,
I'm,
of course."
I'm Rabbi Grimaldi.
Right, and Jesus was. So there.
I was thinking about something while you were talking because my mind tends to be all over the place. You remember that from high school, meaning me. Do you think, on occasion, that we Catholics tend to be a bit, or tend to be snobs when we go to another denomination or church?
When we use the word snob, they're speaking about having the, Catholicism being the only religion.
Or the
that
right,
exists.
I always think the right
The
religion.
correct,
Yeah.
And so there is a little bit of truth to that, or a lot of truth to that, but it has to be explained theologically. One of the things that Jesus said just a couple of weeks ago in the gospel, he says, "There are other sheep that belong to me." that are not necessarily part of this group. Now, I don't have the proper wording, but that's what he said.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus said there are other sheep. And of course, I always think, I love the whole analogy of the shepherd that you talk about, and the sheep and so on. So I still can't get out of my mind that a good shepherd has to smell like a sheep. Okay? And if he doesn't intermingle with them, there's something wrong. And so, but there are other sheep. They're not just this particular group.
Let me move on to a couple of other things. I ran across something the other day, and the Pentecost is coming up, the feast of this coming Sunday, and we've talked at length about it. What we tried to resolve last week was explaining exactly what the Holy Spirit was. I did not remember the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit: wisdom, understanding, counsel, fortitude, knowledge, piety, and fear of the Lord.
Okay, just picture for a moment.
Okay.
All these apostles who had been with Jesus, then they ran away when he was being crucified. They were afraid that they would be associated with him, and then they would also have to be crucified. That's what they thought. So they locked themselves in this room. And Jesus comes, and he appears to them, comes right through the door, and all he says is, "Peace be with you." And the whole idea is that he forgave them. But he goes on to say, there was this great wind, and the Spirit came upon them. The breath of God coming upon these disciples who were so weak and so afraid and so, they felt inadequate about everything. And so all of a sudden, this breath of God. How do we explain the Spirit? The Spirit is the love between the Father and the Son. They call him the spiral between the Father and the Son. He is the third person of the Blessed Trinity. All of these things, or she is the third person of the Blessed Trinity. We don't know. It's a spirit. So we're not speaking about, a human being. So it's interesting to me that all of a sudden the winds were so strong that it shook them up. But it shook them up enough so that they became stronger, because right after that they went out and preached the gospel to all nations as much as they could, and they were not afraid of anything, and they seemed to have wisdom all of a sudden, and they seemed to have fortitude all of a sudden, and they seemed to have understanding and wisdom and all of these good things. Now, this breath of God breathing upon them gave them all of these wonderful gifts to go out into the world and do their job. I like to think of the wind. The wind can be strong, but it could make us stronger too at times, because we have to do battle with it sometimes.
Yes, we do.
And so we come out stronger usually.
Yeah.
And so maybe the wind shook them up. These poor disciples, they were like scared little kids. And all of a sudden, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon them, breathes on them, gives them the energy, the wisdom, the fortitude, all of these good things to go out into the world and do what they have to do. But the Spirit is really every part of our yearnings for religion. The Spirit is praise for us when we need to pray. The Spirit is what makes us moan with prayer to Almighty God. So these poor disciples, they needed everything. They were scared, like little kids. And so afterwards...
There's nothing wrong with being afraid.
No. But all of a sudden, they were strong. They had wisdom and understanding and counsel and fortitude, knowledge, piety, and the fear of the Lord. So it was a gift that they received to make them go out into the world and do what they have to do.
We're just about out of time. And once again, I would like to thank you for a great opportunity to sit down and chat. I want to thank all of the people for sending in these emails, and I encourage them to continue because I enjoy doing this. It makes my work a whole lot easier when I can simply look at your email and then pass it along to the good Father. And you can simply get a hold of us at FatherJoePodcast@gmail.com, fatherjoepodcast@gmail.com. And we'll certainly pass it along and pass along the information as well to your friends and family to have a listen to the Father Joe podcast. Did you have a good time today?
I do the best I can, and I leave the rest up to the Almighty. This is Father Joe Grimaldi, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Father Joe podcast.
If you have a question or a comment for the Father Joe podcast, send it to fatherjoepodcast@gmail.com. That's fatherjoepodcast@gmail.com. Follow Father Joe on Twitter @FatherJoePodcast. The Twitter address again is @FatherJoePodcast. Please subscribe to the Father Joe podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and soon on iHeartRadio. We also ask that you rate the podcast and feel free to leave a comment. And finally, if you have a friend that you think might enjoy the podcast, please pass it along. Thanks again for listening, everybody, and see you next time.